This week, we broaden our scale a bit regarding the concepts we're talking about. We're focusing on large-scale political structures and considering nation-states as a cultural and social form of organization, and globalization as a phenomenon that we now have to contend with in our modern world. So lectures this week focus on two key concepts, and these have to do with the nation-state and with nationalism. So we're beginning with nation-states, which in and of itself has two ideas built into it, two key components. And we use this word differently than how you might hear it in everyday conversation and speaking. So in anthropology, we use this idea of nation to refer to a particular group of people that are associated by history, language, ethnic background, etc. And so an example here is the Cherokee Nation, and so on and so forth. So the concept of nation has to do with people that have something shared within them. And then when we talk about state, somewhat confusing because in everyday conversation, obviously the United States has a particular form of organization involving what we call states, but in Anthro, we're using it differently. We're using it to talk about a mechanism of political control. And so a state, when we talk about the state, doesn't have to do with particular states like in the United States, but instead has to do with political organization and control. So I've given you a definition here. The state is the mechanism of centralized bureaucratic political control over defined territory and the people therein, which has a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. And so a nation-state is an autonomous political unit and can share a sense of common identity, and in fact might have to share a sense of common identity in order to stay cohesive. Robbins uses the term nation-state to refer to shared culture and political power. But we want to break this idea down a little bit more to help you understand a little bit more about particularly states and what this form of social organization really means. The function of the state is to maintain order, and this kind of order is to be maintained in lieu of external threats, such as competing economies, and internal threats, such as revolution, civil war, certain social movements. For example, the civil rights movement at the time was seen as a threat to the state, and so on. So to keep that in mind, that's how the state, that's the function of the state, what it does in the world. Now there's features of states that are built into this definition right here, but I'm going to talk through them a little more slowly. So the first feature of state is that they're centralized. So they have governmental systems that are concentrated and geographically located. So of course for the United States, an example is Washington, D.C. States also have a defined territory. So there's lines on a map that demarcate the location of the control that the state has. The states are also bureaucratic. So they have these, we'll be talking about bureaucracy more in future lectures, but bureaucracy has to do with methods of doing things and keeping track of information and so on. And so an example of a bureaucratic function or bureaucratic aspect of the state is the census that happens on a regular basis. And all of us know there's countless other bureaucratic processes as well. And then perhaps one of the most important features of a state is the monopoly on the legitimate use of force. So only people who are given the responsibility as members of the state can use force legitimately. And so force is used, again, to maintain and enforce social order against external threats and internal threats. So this is becomes a very important feature of the state. That's not to say that other types of force aren't used within a community, but the only ones that have what is understood to be the legitimate use of force, though that can be contested, and we see that happening right now as a national dialogue in the United States regarding police and the use of force by police. In any case, though, the state is legally issues sanction for certain members of the state to use force because the state legitimizes certain use of force by people representing the state. So that's very important. Okay, sovereignty is another important aspect here when we're thinking of nation states, because sovereignty has to do with the supreme power over a limited sphere of territory and people. And so states rely on this sense of sovereignty to ensure their continued existence. It's much easier, cheaper, and efficient to get everyone to think that the state's control over them is normal and good than to have to constantly exert force to maintain control. Thus, the state is always in the position of striving for political legitimacy and maintaining political legitimacy, which, of course, can be contested and is frequently contested. And one of the important aspects of this has to do with a shared sense of national identity. Political legitimacy is rooted in national identity. And that's where nationalism and national identity become really important factors in understanding what's going on with nation states and this kind of social organization. We have to stop and think for a bit about what's happening in the modern world. So globalization has been a fact of life for quite some time. And we have to wonder if sovereignty is changing in this new to scholars, in the world of scholarly discourse, which is very slow to catch up with what's happening in the real world. Globalization is still a relatively new phenomenon. So there's a lot of questions that get raised. Is sovereignty changing in the modern world? And Robbins, in our textbook, in chapter 3, argues that there's this major difference that has emerged between past states and modern nation states, particularly in the extent to which the state has implemented control over trade. So as he discusses in chapter 3, the state now has a goal of perpetual economic growth and is highly involved in trade. And so that is one thing to be considering as far as a change to nation states, this neoliberal economic model, and how that has become a major factor in the state's purpose. And Robbins is right to, of course, bring up this economic perspective. He talks about transnational institutions and companies that might even be replacing nation states, working on a global scale instead of a national scale. These organizations might really be a threat to nation states. We have companies that aren't beholden to anyone's nation state's rules. They now have authority that supersedes that of national governments, and they're not made up of people elected to office, so they're not accountable to people affected by their policies in the same way. So this model, of course, is important. We have to recognize these kinds of points, but he doesn't account for some of the other aspects of globalization. So globalization isn't just about items and trade, though that's a very important driving force. There's a lot of other things that happen too. So while you have expansion of corporate trade and power, you also have the transfer of people, finances, media, cultural forms, etc. And with all this transfer, it's not just stuff that's moving. People bring cultures with them, and mingling of cultures can produce new social forms. And so you have cultural movement and interaction that Robbins doesn't really address. So some examples are migrant workers. So migrant workers coming from one place and moving to another place to work bring all kinds of cultural ways of being in the world with them. And those often are not in isolation. They mingle and mix with cultural forms that are occurring wherever the migrants move to, producing some new forms as well. International finances is another example of things that are moving and being becoming part of these interactions on a global scale. So you have transnational investments and development. Mass media is one that we're all familiar with. You have all forms of media being moving all around the world and interacting with all different cultures. So examples are Bollywood, TV, movies, and hip-hop. Actually, you'll find native interpretations of hip-hop all over the world. Trying to think of, there's a linguistic anthropologist who studies this, and I'm blanking on his name. Oh, Sami Alim. So if you're interested in that, you might look up his work. It's Samyalim. And he looks at how there's a kind of global experience of hip-hop, and you have all these different local interpretations of hip-hop as well. And art forms have moved all around the world on a global scale. It's not just local anymore, and a lot of these art forms are used as a form of protest. Technology is another example. Cell phones are ubiquitous in many developing countries. They're the primary means by which people access the internet all over the world, and this creates connections on a global network that were unforeseen even 10, 20, 30 years ago. Which, when we're talking about the existence of humans on the planet and that interest in humans across time and space, few decades is a very small amount of time. So Robbins really kind of overlooks these other aspects when he is focusing just on trade in Chapter 3. Nonetheless, these kinds of changes are important to just think about regarding those key characteristics of global or of nation states that I was just talking about. So we're going to look at how some of those key characteristics are shifting. Oh, I thought I had a slide for that. Okay, so some of the key characteristics that are shifting is that nation states might not be quite as territorial as they used to be. They might be able to exist beyond territorial borders. For example, you have taxes that are required to be paid by international employees who are not in the country. You have people who live outside of a country for much of their lives, but still consider themselves a part of that country and beholden to some of the country's policies. And then we said that nation states are centralized, but with the type of technologies we have today to communicate, the centralization seems to be shifting quite a bit. So people can participate in democratic elections back home through the use of the internet, through even sending something through the mail, and migrant workers can vote this way from outside of their country, and you can have a political relationship with your country of origin regardless of where you live in the world. And if we think about even how the center of power functions, important figures in any nation state travel all over, make rules and policies that are communicated back to the centralized seat of government. And so in that way, the centralization might be more porous than it used to be. And then we're asking about, we need to ask about legitimacy. So this is a really important question. National identity has changed radically in some areas. For example, we now have the European Union. And economic instability in the European Union over the last 10 years has had a ripple effect for the whole EU. And the EU supersedes nations in many ways. Nation states aren't going away, they're just changing, but it's still unclear how. And they still have to define a shared sense of identity, especially in terms of maintaining legitimacy. And identity is really in flux. So cultural politics becomes something that is happening a lot as a means of trying to deal with this identity issue. So by cultural politics or identity politics, I'm referring to these competing claims about cultural identity that are mobilized to pursue political ends. Typically, this is in the form of nationalist claims about identity. They tend to appeal to traditions and shared cultural backgrounds, and status is up for grabs in these competing claims, so they can be really important. I put up here images of France because right now we have lots of coverage in the media about events in France that in many ways have to do with cultural politics. So I put a more traditional image of what it means to be French. And then I also included this book, which, full disclosure, I haven't read it. But this book is all about identity politics in France. And obviously you can see from the title, Muslim Girls and the Other France. So that might be an interesting, if you're interested in this topic, as it's playing out in France right now, that might be an interesting starting point to check out that book. In any case, what we see is claims about cultural identity playing out in order to pursue political ends. So in France, we see these claims to France and this identity of France as being a secular country in order to justify political policies and movements to limit people who are Muslim in a variety of ways, including even what they can wear. This happens in many, many different countries all over the world. It's not just in France. France is just a very present or immediate example that is in the news right now as I record this. And as I said, status is up for grabs in these competing claims, so the stakes are high. If you consider the different policies for people within France, ethnic minorities in France, there's a lot to lose within these competitions for identity claims. In the United States, there's been a cultural politics playing out regarding same-sex marriage and also citizen status for people who immigrate to this country without documents. So how do we define who constitutes a married couple? How should we define who can work and live in our state? And a lot of this, these have huge implications for people whose lives they affect very directly, and they get played out with claims about cultural identity. Resources are also at stake in these kinds of cultural politics. For example, the Occupy Wall Street movement was all about access to resources, access to education, jobs, healthcare, and so on. And that's another way in which things are at stake in these kinds of political debates and crises. Meaning is another thing that's at stake with cultural politics. So an example from the United States has to do with creationism debate. It's about identity as a country. In France, something very similar going on regarding religion and identity as a country. And cultural politics is just really about how we should define ourselves as a shared group of people, including people we don't see face to face on a regular basis. When we get to this nation-state level of organization, there's a big challenge in terms of bringing everybody together in a shared identity. Fragmentation is a constant threat to the state. A typical feature of the modern nation-state is fragmentation. You have all these people together who don't know each other, will never meet each other, and how do you foster a sense of shared identity and cohesiveness in that kind of situation? Well, Benedict Anderson is someone who can help us out with this. He said that modern nation states have to foster a sense of an imagined community, and he wrote a book in 1983 called Imagined Communities. Benedict Anderson, I put a little bit of info here about him. He's an Irish political scientist, and he was interested in this question: how do countries bring diverse groups of people together? One example is Indonesia. There's a multi-ethnic state with fighting and strife, and what can be done so that people can be brought together in some sort of shared sense of cohesiveness. We see this in a lot of countries in Africa as well, where you have multi-ethnic states, and that creates all kinds of upheaval and even civil war. So how can states mitigate that in some way? And he said the way that it happens is through imagined communities. An imagined community is a form of belonging in large-scale societies that relies on a feeling of connectedness to a group too large to meet face-to-face. Anderson argues that this is a necessity in all modern states, again, to avoid that idea of fragmentation. For example, the U.S. is so ethnically diverse, it could be easy for this country to fragment and into smaller communities. Imagined communities is one tool the state uses to prevent fragmentation. And for Benedict Anderson, media and museums were key ways that an imagined community were fostered. He argues that in the 19th century, as capitalism and print technology merged, you see a standardization of language and solidified a shared sense of national identity. This provided a structure that national movements could base their claims on, and especially through newspapers. So a community that stretches beyond space and time, beyond face-to-face interactions, and small-scale communities involves a shared common experience. Newspapers does this. You have stories being published in newspapers, and all over the nation, people are sitting down reading the same stories. The idea is that this gives some sort of common ground for people, even if they might never meet face-to-face. They're media-driven narratives that tell us what to focus our attention on, and even in many ways what to think about these things that are happening. Nonetheless, they create this common ground that people can all over be thinking about, and that is a sense of imagined community. Another form, so newspapers were really important for fostering imagined communities in Benedict Anderson's theory, and museums was another component. He said with museums you have all these people going through these exhibits and seeing the same story of what it means to be part of this nation, for example, the History Museum, or even the same ideals of what's important, what various information means, etc. Again, being something that creates this common ground among people that can help people feel connected, even if they never meet each other. Nowadays, it's different with the internet. He wasn't writing when the internet was big, but you can go online and get so many more perspectives, and sources of news are in many ways becoming more fragmented. So maybe the identity will have even greater challenges for being cohesive as well. But nobody really knows at this point how Benedict Anderson's idea of imagined communities will hold up in the internet age.